800,000 years ago, long before cities, farming, or even modern humans existed, a group of children disappeared into a cave in what is now northern Spain. What happened to them was preserved with astonishing detail, not in stories or paintings, but in their bones. For decades, many people assumed prehistoric cannibalism was nothing more than a desperate act of survival, a last resort when food ran out. But the deeper scientists dug into the evidence, the more disturbing the truth became. What if eating other humans wasn't an emergency? What if, for thousands of years, it was simply dinner? The image most of us have of prehistoric cannibalism is surprisingly comforting. We imagine starving people trapped by impossible circumstances, making horrifying choices because they had no alternative. It allows us to keep a safe distance from the past. If they had enough food, surely they would never have done it. But anthropology has gradually dismantled that assumption. Researchers don't lump all cannibalism into a single category. They make a critical distinction that changes everything. The first is survival cannibalism. This is the kind that happens during famines, shipwrecks, or disasters, when death is imminent and no other food exists. The second category has a far more unsettling name: gastronomic or dietary cannibalism. This isn't about survival, it's about preference. It describes societies that consumed human flesh under normal conditions, even though other food sources were available. That distinction sounds subtle, but it completely transforms how we interpret some of humanity's oldest archaeological sites. Because once you separate starvation from choice, the evidence begins telling an entirely different story. One of the most important pieces of that story comes from Dolina cave in Spain. This site is roughly 800,000 years old. That's so ancient it predates our own species. The individuals who lived there belong to Homo antecessor, one of our extinct human relatives. When archaeologists first uncovered the remains, they noticed something deeply unusual. The bones carried unmistakable cut marks. They had been dismembered with stone tools. The joints had been carefully separated. The bones had been broken open. At first glance, that might sound like evidence of violence. But then researchers compared these human remains with the nearby animal bones. They had been processed almost identically. The same butchering techniques, the same cuts, the same patterns of marrow extraction. Whoever handled these bodies treated humans exactly as they treated the animals they hunted for food. Even more disturbing was who the victims were. They weren't exclusively adults. The remains included individuals ranging from infants to teenagers. Children made up a remarkable portion of the victims. If this had been an isolated massacre, perhaps there might be another explanation. But the archaeological patterns suggested something much more routine. Researchers concluded these people were not being consumed because starvation forced impossible decisions. Other prey animals were present at the site. Food existed. Instead, scientists described the behavior using a precise term: gastronomic cannibalism. In other words, eating humans as a normal part of the diet. That conclusion forces an uncomfortable question. If prehistoric humans had other food available, why would they still eat each other? The answer may lie in the fact that not every act of cannibalism had the same purpose. Some were nutritional, others were symbolic, others became something even stranger. Because thousands of years later, human flesh wasn't simply eaten. Human remains were transformed into objects. Travel forward to England about 15,000 years ago. Inside Gough's cave, archaeologists discovered another remarkable collection of human bones. Again, the cut marks were unmistakable. Human teeth had left bite marks on the bones themselves. This wasn't scavenging. This wasn't accidental damage. These people had clearly consumed human bodies. But one discovery stood apart from everything else. Several skulls had been deliberately modified. Instead of being discarded, portions of the skull had been carefully shaped into smooth containers. Essentially, cups or bowls. Imagine the amount of planning required. This wasn't random destruction. It required removing soft tissue, reshaping bone, smoothing edges, and preserving the finished object. These skulls weren't simply leftovers from a meal. They became tools, possibly drinking vessels used during rituals. That transforms the entire event. Cannibalism wasn't merely about calories. The body continued serving a purpose long after death. It became part of ceremony, part of memory, part of identity. And that raises another uncomfortable misconception. We often imagine cannibalism happening between enemies, savage outsiders attacking helpless victims. But history records something far more emotionally complex. In several societies studied by ethnographers, families consumed their own relatives, not because they hated them, because they loved them. This practice is known as funerary cannibalism. When a family member died, relatives believed consuming portions of the body honored the deceased. Some believed it prevented the loved one from decaying abandoned beneath the earth. Others believed something even more profound, that wisdom, strength, or spiritual essence could pass from the dead into the living. To us, the idea feels shocking. Yet within those cultures, refusing to participate could be viewed as disrespectful. The same physical act carried an entirely different meaning depending on the beliefs surrounding it. The body wasn't food, it was remembrance, an act of devotion. That realization forces us to reconsider a dangerous habit, projecting our own values backward through history. Ancient people were not thinking with modern assumptions. They inhabited entirely different worlds of meaning. And nowhere does that become more tragically clear than among the Fore people of Papua New Guinea. Unlike Gran Dolina or Gough's cave, this wasn't ancient prehistory. It happened within living memory. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, researchers documented a funerary tradition in which recently deceased relatives were consumed during mortuary ceremonies. The participants were primarily women and young children. Men participated far less frequently. No one realized they were also participating in one of the deadliest biological experiments in human history. A mysterious disease began spreading through foray communities. Victims gradually lost coordination. They developed tremors. Walking became impossible. Speech deteriorated. Eventually, the brain itself began failing. The disease became known as kuru. At its height, it killed as much as 2% of the entire Fore population every single year. Entire villages watched generation after generation disappear. What made kuru uniquely terrifying wasn't simply how it killed, it was what it did to the brain. Scientists eventually discovered that kuru belongs to a group of illnesses called transmissible spongiform encephalopathies. As the disease progresses, brain tissue literally develops countless microscopic holes. Under a microscope, healthy tissue gradually takes on the appearance of a sponge. But perhaps the most frightening feature wasn't the damage, it was the waiting. Someone exposed during childhood might appear perfectly healthy for decades. Symptoms could remain hidden for as long as 50 years. Imagine attending a funeral feast as a child, growing up, starting a family, watching your own children become adults. Then, half a century later, the disease silently awakens. A single meal from childhood determining your fate as a grandparent. Yet hidden inside this tragedy lies one of the most extraordinary examples of human evolution ever discovered. Because evolution was watching. Within the 4 population, scientists identified a rare genetic mutation known as G127V. Outside this region, it is almost non-existent. Research suggests this mutation spread under intense natural selection during the kuru epidemic. Individuals carrying it appeared resistant to the disease. In other words, cannibalism left a measurable fingerprint inside the human genome. Our DNA still preserves evidence of behaviors practiced by our ancestors, not through stories, not through myths, but through survival itself. Genes became historical documents, living records of ancient choices. That realization changes how we think about archaeology, because bones aren't the only evidence scientists investigate. Sometimes the evidence exists inside every living cell. Still, one challenge remained. How could researchers be absolutely certain those ancient cut marks represented cannibalism rather than ordinary decay or animal scavenging? After all, bones can be damaged in countless ways over hundreds of thousands of years. The answer required an unusual experiment. Researchers performed controlled butchering on a chimpanzee carcass. Chimpanzees provide one of the closest anatomical comparisons available. Scientists carefully documented every cut, fracture, and tool mark created during the process. Then they compared those experimental patterns with the ancient Homo antecessor remains from Gran Dolina. The similarities were striking. The cuts appeared in the same anatomical locations. The breakage patterns matched. The evidence lined up with remarkable precision. Modern scientists had effectively recreated a prehistoric crime scene, not to sensationalize the past, but to test whether the archaeological evidence truly supported the conclusions. And it did. Sometimes the strongest scientific evidence comes from repeating ancient actions under controlled conditions, as uncomfortable as those actions may be. But perhaps the most surprising discovery comes from Central Europe. For years, archaeologists debated who the victims of prehistoric cannibalism actually were. Were invading outsiders captured and consumed by local groups, or something else? At Maszczyka Cave in present-day Poland, genetic analysis finally offered an unexpected answer. The cannibalized individuals shared ancestry with people buried hundreds of kilometers away at Magdalenian sites in Western Europe. Rather than representing strangers from distant populations, the evidence suggested something much more intimate. Closely related hunter-gatherer groups. People who were, genetically speaking, extended family. Instead of foreign invaders consuming locals, neighboring groups sharing common ancestry may have been fighting over territory. The violence wasn't occurring between completely different peoples. It was happening within humanity's own extended branches. Competition, conflict, consumption, not between strangers, but between relatives separated by geography. And then, something changed. Across Europe, archaeological evidence for cannibalism begins fading, not gradually, remarkably consistently. As one cultural tradition disappeared, another emerged. The Magdalenian culture gave way to the Epigravidians. One difference stands out above all others. Instead of consuming their dead, they buried them. That shift may represent one of the greatest cultural turning points in human history. Think about what burial means. A body is no longer viewed as food, nor as a vessel for absorbing wisdom, nor as raw material for ritual objects. Instead, it becomes something to preserve, something to protect, something deserving of a permanent resting place. The invention of burial didn't simply change funerals. It may have transformed humanity's entire relationship with death. One cultural practice quietly replaced another, not because biology changed overnight, but because ideas did. The human body acquired a new meaning, and meaning has always been one of our species' greatest evolutionary advantages. When we look back across these discoveries, the story becomes far more complicated than the familiar image of desperate cave dwellers eating one another to survive. Some prehistoric people almost certainly practiced survival cannibalism, but others didn't. Some treated human bodies as ordinary food. Some transformed skulls into ritual vessels. Some consumed loved ones out of devotion. Some unknowingly spread devastating neurological disease. Some even left evolutionary traces that still exist inside living DNA. None of this excuses the practice, nor should it be romanticized. Instead, it reminds us that human behavior has always been shaped by culture, just as much as biology. Actions that seem unimaginable today once existed inside belief systems that made perfect sense to the people living them. That realization can be deeply uncomfortable because it challenges a comforting assumption that modern humans are fundamentally different from those who came before. The truth may be more subtle. Our biology hasn't changed nearly as much as our ideas have. The greatest distance between us and our ancient ancestors may not be measured in years. It may be measured in meaning. So here's the question that archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians continue asking. If you had lived inside one of those ancient cultures, surrounded from birth by beliefs that treated cannibalism as normal, respectful, or even sacred, would you have seen anything wrong with it? Or are our strongest moral convictions more dependent on culture than we'd ever like to admit? Let me know what you think in the comments.